good afternoon, everyone. This presentation is almost going to take the form of a traditional lecture to the extent that I'm not really making an overarching point. Instead, I'm going to try and offer a condensed intellectual history of approaches to the origins and evolution of writing. And a version of this will be coming out in the annual review of anthropology, hopefully next month. And if you're watching this online in the future, you might be able to download it for free already. And if you can't, just send me an email and send it to you. And I want to thank Pippa and Stephen Houston for checking the factual content, some of the factual content of this paper. And as I speak, I'm not going to name and cite and acknowledge everyone's research as I go, just to save time, but rest assured that if I'm mentioning your research, I have attributed you in the paper. So all of us here are interested in various aspects of writing. We all have our own particular specialisms, but it seems that no matter what we study or how we study it, sooner or later, these kinds of grand theoretical questions intrude and they demand attention. So if you're someone who feels like they don't have a handle on the origins and evolution of writing, I really hope that this can serve as a roadmap for navigating the huge literature that's been growing over at least the last 4 centuries. So this is a bit of a whirlwind tour. I'm trying to jam a whole lot of information into a short-ish presentation, and there are times when I'll get a little bit technical, but I hope that there'll be something in here for everyone, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion at the end, and maybe we can pick up a few of these issues and look at them in much more detail. Origins and evolution are lofty themes, and as a result, I think they've attracted a certain kind of prestige or a certain glamour, and I don't think that's helpful in and of itself, because there is much more to writing than the question of how it originates and how it changes. But I do think it's important to be aware of big theory, no matter what your methodological preferences are. So when you spend a lot of time, as we do, looking at these details under the microscope, it's occasionally a good idea, I think, to step back and try and have a look at the view from space as well. And to be in the habit of um, looking at this question from different scales, so the bigger scale and the smaller scale. Um, and just we had this conversation at the beginning about what that image up the top is. It is from La Pasiega rock cave in Spain. I think it's either between 16 and 22,000 years before present, from Gallery B, and it's known as the inscription. It was first, I think, sketched by Henri Poy, but a lot of people in this room saw it as not as a rock gallery, but as a tattoo on a hairy arm. So I just wanted to clarify that that is actually a rock painting. Okay. So I come to these topics with my own experiences and partialities that are going to influence how I represent the material. So I want you to know a little bit about me up front. I started off as a documentary linguist. I was very interested in rare and underdocumented languages of Australia, but I ended up working in the southern Philippines on an Australian government-sponsored project to record a minority language on the large island of Bohol. And this language turned out to have a very surprising history. According to its speakers, the language had at first been deliberately erased by the Spanish colonial authorities, but it was later said to have been restored to the community by miraculous means between about 1920 and 1937. And when I studied it, the language had all the hallmarks of an auxiliary language, in other words, an invented language. And significantly too, it was embodied in an extremely complex and irregular writing system that you can see there, apparently derived from organs of the human body. So my interest began to shift from the nuts and bolts of language, things like phonology, morphology, syntax, lexicon, those sorts of things, to more anthropological questions, how to connect those things to society. So I wanted to know, how do people manipulate and extend language to do things other than ordinary communication? And I began to see writing in this way too, as a linguistic extension or manipulation. It's not, as we all know, a neutral representation of language, but I see it kind of like an artificial prosthetic that's capable of performing social as well as communicative actions. So this led me to look at Southeast Asia and the Pacific more widely as a kind of zone of experimentation in new writing systems. And I encountered a similar kind of zone in West Africa. And it struck me that all of these writing systems and the social institutions they were attached to could tell us something important about writing as a phenomenon, as a practice, but also the trial and error processes involved in inventing writing. In other words, I began to look at contemporary cases of invention and creativity as a way of understanding ancient inventions of writing as well. In fact, the last time I was here in the Faculty of Classics, 7 years ago, I was talking about, at the Cruise Conference, I was talking about convergent typological features of writing systems invented by non-literate communities, primarily in Southeast Asia and West Africa. But concurrently, I became very interested in graphic codes that are non-linguistic, as Pippa mentioned, but that do things that are both communicative and social. So for the last decade, I've been increasingly zooming in on Indigenous systems from Australia. There's a message stick up there. Australia is conveniently where I'm from and where I now live, and I'm very happy to talk about this work with any of you if you're interested. And the point is just to say that my disposition when it comes to these questions is anthropological and comparative. Okay, the history of writing is more challenging to understand than it first seems. So let's start by looking at languages. Humans have been speaking languages for perhaps 300,000 years. I mean, that's as long as we've been anatomically modern. Today, there are around 400 independent language families in the world, and from these 400 language families have emerged about 7,000 named individual languages spoken today. Investigating the origins of language is demanding. So not only is the time depth really significant, and you think about language change and then you add 300,000 years, but language leaves no persistent trace. Thinking about language origins requires leaps of the imagination and a lot of a priori reasoning. We're on slightly more secure ground with language evolution, but contrast this with writing. People have been writing for a mere 5,000 plus years, and there are only 4 agreed upon lineages of writing representing around 100 scripts in total, including scripts that are no longer used. So already compared to language, writing is much more recent, visible, and finite. We can uncover durable inscriptions and study them in a way that's simply not possible for most languages, unless those languages are, of course, in the inscriptions. In fact, linguists studying contemporary languages will reduce them to writing first in order to make them easier to analyze. So writing is really an analytical affordance in itself. So all this would lead you to believe, perhaps, that we can understand the origins and evolution of writing simply by reviewing the material symbolic record. Yet despite all these advantages, questions of writing's earliest origins and evolutionary pathways remain complex, unresolved, and pressing. So here I just want to kind of summarize the long history of scholarship on the origin and evolution of writing, focusing on some of the recurrent issues that continue to provoke debate, and I'll also be talking a bit about consensus positions as well. But I aim to show that the most enduring questions concern how writing relates to social organization, how it builds on non-linguistic symbolic codes, how it variably models linguistic structure, and how it is deployed and manipulated in culturally relative ways, and also how it may be limited or extended by the parameters of the human mind. So those are a lot of disparate themes that don't always easily intersect. So when I use the term synthesis, it's more about trying to condense these questions into something manageable rather than to try to tie them all neatly together. But I do think that a true synthesis of these questions is what we should at least be aiming for. And if there's time at the end, I might suggest some approaches to doing that. Okay. So it turns out that people have been reflecting on the origins and evolution of writing for a very long time. I'd go so far as to say that for as long as writing has existed, people have come up with ways of trying to understand it. And I encourage you to think about knowledge traditions more expansively than simply contemporary academic disciplines in Europe and the Anglosphere. I'm talking about philosophical traditions, folklore traditions, and scriptural or religious traditions. These have all had something to say writing. Um, The earliest surviving knowledge traditions express an intellectual curiosity about writing and an urge to make sense of its power and purposes. And one theme in early thought that I find really interesting is the attribution of writing to distinctly human culture heroes, from the biblical Adam and Eve to Moses, Abraham, and Cadmus. In China, legendary rulers such as Fuxi, Shennong, or Kangxi, and you'll have to forgive my pronunciation, are given credit for writing, while in South Asia, named ancestors are cited for specific indic scripts, for creating specific scripts. And I'd love to hear from all of you about origin stories for the systems that you work on. In all these traditions, writing is often represented as an artificial and historically contingent technology, even if its earthly creators might have taken inspiration from supernatural patrons. Human agency is also really privileged in accounts of its evolutionary trajectories, in which writing is seen to change and be improved upon by like historical actors. So we see this in China, especially, where various scribes or emperors are said to have intervened in the way writing has developed. In China, also, an early and ongoing concern has been the assumed relationship between writing and political authority, political and moral authority. Writing is a prestige technology in this tradition, and this is a view that would later emerge in a different way in the West, which I'll get to. By contrast, processes of reading in many early knowledge traditions are regularly likened to experiences of miraculous revelation. So writing is something you do with intention, but reading is something that happens to you. And I have a talk on this topic online if you're interested. So I have more to say about early knowledge traditions, and I really love, I love folklore about writing. Um, but I'm now going to zoom forward to a time when writing became part of a defined scholarly discourse. Okay. Um, from the early modern period onwards, expanding European empires began to come into contact with societies that had diverse practices of graphic communication. And in response, Western theories of writing coalesced around presumptive cultural hierarchies based on either the presence or absence of literacy in a given society, but also things like the relative iconicity of signs in a graphic system and how close they were to being alphabetic, or at least appearing alphabetic. By the 19th century, this global hierarchy was no longer seen as static, but dynamic and evolving. So in the social evolutionist model, all societies were understood to be generating ever increasing levels of sophistication, in which technological innovations occurred in lockstep with changes in social and political organization. In this framework, writing came to be theorized as a diagnostic marker of civilization. Um, quote unquote civilization, the ultimate achievement of all industrial, intellectual, and moral progress. And this view is expressed in ways, even by people like Champollion in 1824 and Hegel at around about the same time. And as far forward as Arthur Evans, you get reflections of this view. And it's a very tenacious view, and it has its roots, I argue, in the 17th century, but it really solidified in the 19th century, especially in Europe and North America. So proponents of this model treated complexity, however defined, as a proxy measure of incremental technological improvement. And this created a problem for ranking the known writing systems of the world, since the Phoenician-derived alphabets, the proud inheritance of the West, were comparatively simple, with small inventories of letters that were oriented to phonemes as opposed to syllables or morphemes. However, when thinkers acknowledged this contradiction, the alphabet's apparent simplicity was merely recast as a virtue in terms of its efficiency, transparency, and adaptability to new languages. In other words, it's a little bit embarrassing that Western alphabets like Roman or Greek are quite simple, because simplicity is associated with primitivity in the theory. But it's okay because they're just really efficient, unlike, say, cumbersome Chinese or Egyptian hieroglyphs. But then that same efficiency is not then attributed to, say, for example, hunter-gatherer subsistence, because you can make the dangerous case that the so-called savages of Australia or the Kalahari or the Arctic Circle are thriving in extremely harsh conditions with very few tools. That should also count as technological efficiency. So there's a double standard built into the theory. It was also in the 19th century that Western scholars regarded Mesopotamia as the sole site of invention, as you can see in this diagram from Gelb, leading to a conflation of the known history of writing with the origin and development of all writing. As such, the monogenesis or one origin hypothesis assumed that writing developed in the context of accounting and that it followed a unilinear trajectory from iconic logograms to syllabic signs and eventually to alphabets. In this way, the evolutionary arc of all human progress was seen to be replicated at a smaller scale in the evolutionary story of writing itself. So it's kind of recursive. So I think we're all familiar with the story of monogenesis and social evolutionism, and there is a risk of belaboring that story or even of kind of self-flagellating over it. But I think it does need to be told and retold because it's still hanging around in the groundwater. It's in popular culture, and it continues to influence in subtle ways. It continues to influence scientific discourse around such questions as complexity, efficiency, fitness, cumulative culture, and so on. So it's really worth being aware of this history so as not to accidentally replicate it. And as we'll see, it's the writing system specialists who really held on to social evolutionism most tenaciously, longer than others. Because by the 1920s, the once formidable social evolutionist model had begun to unravel within anthropology under the weight of countervailing cross-cultural evidence. And the complexity fallacy that I mentioned before, that was part of its undoing. Um, Small-scale societies in the colonized world were revealed to possess languages and modes of social organization that were far more complex than the quote-unquote civilized West. Social evolutionism nonetheless retained appeal among archaeologists and writing system specialists until the middle of the 20th century, as instantiated in the influential work of Ignaz Gelb, David Diringer, and V. Gordon Childe. But monogenesis was on borrowed time. And here's where we get to what I call the modern paradigm, because by the end of the 20th century, not so long ago, new archaeological discoveries and paleographic decipherments confirmed an incontrovertible reality, and that is that writing has up to four independent sites of origin: Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, Mesoamerica. Of course, there may be more than four, and there's still some controversy over the independence of cuneiform Egyptian and Chinese, but I think we can safely say that there's probably at least four primary scripts. And on the face of it, these primary scripts were invented under a narrow set of social and historical conditions. All four were societies that managed surpluses of resources, including labor, through centralized administrations. In all sites, writing was eventually deployed to project political and spiritual power, often through elite display behavior, among other uses. But beyond this, very little could be generalized. In Mesopotamia, writing was developed in the context of the accounting of tradable resources, while its earliest use in Egypt was perhaps for categorizing grave goods. In China, the first uses of writing are unclear until it comes into archaeological focus in divination rituals. And in Mesoamerica, where writing was most recently reinvented and rediscovered, the purposes of the earliest datable texts cannot yet be ascertained at all, and their prospects for full decipherment are low. And yet the Mesoamerican evidence has been particularly convulsive. Contrary to social evolutionist predictions, early texts appear to be more narrowly linguistic or numerical, while later instantiations pivot back and forth between pictorial semasiography and more linear glottography. I'm going to use the word glottography a lot, by which I just mean language-based writing, so it represents linguistic information. And this is an observation, this kind of pivoting back and forth, that was made by Stephen Houston. That means that the assumed sequence from pictures or pictographs ratcheting up to glottographic signs is all mixed up. And Mesoamerica bucked the trend in other respects too. So the archaeologist V. Gordon Childe, who I mentioned before, he couldn't reconcile the fact that the ancient Maya had a calendar and a writing system, yet lacked metal tools, wheeled vehicles, and intensive agriculture. So they weren't sticking to the theory, which was very inconvenient. So really, by the end of the 20th century, the whole unilinear model that was popularized by Gelb just has to be thrown away. There's no sustaining it. Okay. So nonetheless, when it came to grammatical descriptions of underlying systems, Gelb's typological framework was, I think, a good start, because I think this is really when writing systems began to be studied descriptively in the same kinds of ways that languages are studied descriptively. You describe grammar and vocabulary, which allows you to bring typologies and relationships into focus. And this is important because structuralist linguistics had kind of rejected writing as a legitimate object of study. And for good reasons, I think. In the 19th century traditions of philology, there had been a tendency to only investigate languages that were written languages, primarily prestige languages like Latin, Greek, English, French, Sanskrit, and so on, and to study them via historical texts. So linguists wanted to, I guess, correct for that and say, language is what you speak, and writing is just a shadow of that. So let's focus on orality and let's look at all these rare and beautiful indigenous languages that are not written down, which is most languages. It's still most languages. So it came from a good place, but it meant that writing was neglected by linguists until you get really this volume from, oh, whoops, where am I? Back here. So this volume there that you're familiar with, probably from Daniels and Bright, that demonstrated that writing can be analyzed in rigorous linguistic terms. Linguistically informed approaches to the analysis of writing have been called grammatology by Daniels, but I like the term grapholinguistics popularized by Demetrios Miletus because it doesn't seek to claim the whole field. It's merely saying linguistics can do a lot of cool stuff, including an analysis of writing systems. You can do this in a linguistic frame. And I think this means that other disciplines have space to demonstrate their value. If you wanted to, you could imagine a kind of a graphosociology, or to think of paleography as a kind of graphoarchaeology. And I'm not saying we should do this. I'm saying it leaves room to think about how existing methods can be reapplied to writing, in this case, linguistic methods. So with grapholinguistics, or whatever you want to call it, we get this expanded and refined vocabulary for describing the systematicity of writing in terms of how it maps linguistic values onto graphic values. Of course, this terminology continues to be reanalyzed and debated. We're often worrying about, should we call it ideography, or, things like semasiography, logography, morphography, abjad syllabary, all of that stuff. But I think that the negotiation has been productive. So I think it's good to have that conversation. But how does this typological fussiness over terms and debate over definitions help address our big themes of origins and evolution? It does this, I think, by drawing attention to the finite strategies of linguistic value mapping primed by the morphophonological structure of diverse languages. So think about what I said right at the beginning about how raw linguistic diversity is an order of magnitude greater than writing system diversity. So having accurate tools of measurement gives us a way of tracking changes over time and of testing evolutionary assumptions and maybe coming up with better models. So, for example, when an existing writing system is transferred to a new language, the system may sometimes undergo a process of retrofitting by targeting smaller and more minimally contrasted units of language structure per Gelb's predictions, but it may also move in the opposite direction towards expansion. Or the writing system just doesn't change much at all. Instead, it retains apparently superfluous features while at the same time underrepresenting linguistic structure. All these things are possible. And grapholinguistic typology gives us tools for measuring this and perhaps disentangling variables. There's another thing it helps with, and this is a theory I've been fascinated by for a long time. It's what I call the glass slipper hypothesis for the origin of writing. And this is the concept of linguistic fit and the notion that languages with certain morphological and phonological structures lend themselves to easier representation in writing. And this idea goes back to at least Schlegel in 1808 and others afterwards. And it's the so-named isolating languages like Mandarin Chinese or Bamong in Cameroon, in which morphemes are isomorphic with syllables. They're assumed to be a better fit for writing, given that sound, the sign, sound, and meaning all converge. So this glass slipper theory suggests that speakers of such languages would be more likely to discover and take advantage of the glottographic principle since their linguistic structures are easily represented in discrete graphic units. So for Chinese, every word or morpheme is one syllable and it can thus be represented with one independent graphic sign. It all just slides into place. At least that's the theory. Some versions of this hypothesis argue that languages with consonantal roots and inflecting vowels, such as Sumerian and Egyptian, are perhaps even better candidates, and this is because their structure is phonemically segmented by their morphology, encouraging segmental awareness in speakers. And you could have of course, say the same thing about Chinese. The structure is phonemically segmented by the morphology, so it's kind of oven ready for writing, if you like. So while there may be no easy way of demonstrating or falsifying the glass slipper hypothesis, reflections on this theme, I think, are far from sterile. They remind us that writing is deeply entangled in language and that there may be unidentified or as yet unidentified linguistic affordances for its creation, even before considering the wider social and technological contexts. But let's get on to those contexts. And look at an old hypothesis that everyone here knows about, which is that writing only emerges in state societies. So you remember that within the social evolutionist paradigm, there was an assumed deterministic relationship between writing and so-called civilization. But this kind of gets corrected, or at least refined in the 20th century, when scholars restated this as a question about the possible priming conditions of social and economic organization. Some argued that writing was predisposed to emerge within state societies with centralized political authority. So this includes people like Arthur Evans in the early 20th century, all the way up to the late James C. Scott in the 21st century. But others made the case from historical evidence that while writing might optionally be used as a tool of statecraft, it could also originate or be enthusiastically taken up within non-state societies. And this is where I tend to fall. So it came down to a question of functionalism or cause and effect. Does writing originate because it's fulfilling a very specific social need, or is writing independent of that need and it merely gets recruited to serve existing social institutions? Or is there even some sort of feedback loop going on here? And this ties in with the literacy debates prompted by people like Jack Goody, Walter Ong, and Brian Street, who have argued over what institutional literacy as a capacity actually does to a society. In the so-named autonomous or Great Divide model, populations that acquire literacy are seen to achieve enhanced capacities for complex analytical thought, and by implication, writing introduces a powerful new tool for social change, including state building and eventually industrialization. But a contrasting ideological model emphasizes that literacy is not categorically distinct from orality and that its purported consequences have much more to do with its relationship to existing social institutions and power structures rather than any sudden transformations of human potential. And as you might guess from my approach, that's where I land. I think literacy is not magic or suddenly transformative of human capacities. It's a tool that is optionally used to support existing agendas or practices. Beyond state administration, religion is also one of those things that's regularly invoked as either a push factor or a source of inspiration in the development of writing, especially within those early knowledge traditions I outlined at the beginning. And certainly across all four lineages, writing has been used for the glorification of supernatural as much as political entities. And in Shang China, writing was the privileged mode of communication with the dead, and not just with the oracle bone divination, but in the kind of lesser known use of ritual burning of inscribed bamboo. And this is intuitive to me because the observed capacity for writing to speak across time and distance offers an appealing mechanism for communicating with gods or spirits. But writing has other more mundane advantages, I think, for religious institutions. It means that orthodoxy can be fixed in a canonical form, allowing for the development of a stable scriptural tradition. And on top of this, the institutionally mediated nature of literacy creates a natural barrier against challenges to a spiritual order, meaning you have to be an elite to be literate because it's costly and it involves institutional investment. and you're getting religion and literacy as a package deal. Not everyone gets to be in on the deal on the same terms. But then consider the role of literacy in the European Reformation. Expanded access to literacy became a challenge to the existing social order, as well as a vehicle for a new social order with its own orthodoxies. And this in turn contributes to the spread of literacy. Christian missionaries, for example, often conflated processes of becoming literate in the Roman alphabet with becoming Christian. And similar dynamics were at play, I think, in the spread of the Arabic script that went hand in hand with the spread of Islam. So I think this is another good lens for looking at the question of feedback loops. So these kinds of functionalist or needs-based arguments lead us to an even more foundational question when it comes to origins and evolution of writing. What if function or purpose doesn't really matter that much at all when it comes to emergence? Because, of course, you can point to canonical state societies with centralized political authority that, in fact, didn't invent writing at all, despite having apparently all the social, economic, or religious prerequisites for it. And this is when it's helpful to contrast needs-based approaches with use-based approaches. In other words, what are people actually doing with graphic signs, regardless of function? An abiding theory is that full writing systems are later adaptations of already conventionalized non-linguistic codes that were first applied for other purposes. So in Mesopotamia and Egypt, this is at least partially borne out by archaeological evidence. Early glottographic signs can be seen to take direct inspiration from preceding or concurrent notations that have semantic or numeric values but not linguistic values. From the 19th century, a frequently cited affordance for the transition to glottography or to language-based writing was the so-called rebus principle, in which an icon comes to stand for a homophonous referent. And subsequently, the associated sound values can then be recombined in new arrangements to represent components of a linguistic sequence. This is something you all know about. And in like manner, the acrophonic principle involves abbreviating words or morphemes to generate flexible phonetic units that don't necessarily retain their original phonemic values. And thank you, Pippa, for helping me out with acrophony. Examples of rebus and to lesser extent acrophony are found in early Sumerian cuneiform, Chinese, Egyptian, and Mayan, suggesting that the strategy may be a universal. And similarly, semantic determinatives, which I'm trying to get into the habit of calling classifiers now, signs for distinguishing homophones have also been independently innovated across lineages. Yet in most cases, this is the point, in most cases, these processes can only account for a very small number of sign forms, and full systematization must occur by other means. What I'm saying is that the importance attributed to rebuses as a kind of necessary stepping stone to glottography or full writing has probably been overstated. A minimalist model for the transition to glottography was proposed by William Boltz, who posited that a given graph G has properties of being non-semantic, minus S, or semantic, plus S, or non-phonetic or phonetic, and any combination of these values is possible. And critically, however, forerunner, quote unquote, forerunner notational segments must be plus S before they become plus P. And rebus and acrophony may be mechanisms that give access to the possibility of phoneticization, but they're neither necessary nor sufficient conditions. And William Boltz gave an excellent talk on this for Cruz back in 2020, I think, and you can look that up online. Was it Cruz or was it Sylvia's group? All right. So for Scribo, you can look it up under Scribo. As Richard Sproat has argued, Richard Sproat was another visitor here, I believe, sign systems may be put under pressure to increase the number of representable terms, encouraging a greater role for phoneticization, regardless of the available affordances. So what he's saying is you don't need to posit a mechanism. It's enough to put a sign system under pressure to do new things, and people find a way. People figure it out. Deeper time gradualist models for transitions to glottography have proven to be less convincing, at least to me. For example, some archaeologists have speculated that sequential markings on Upper Paleolithic portable objects and on cave walls, like the picture we saw at the beginning, represent a form of very early proto-writing. And this is an idea that goes right back to the 1880s. However, no study has positively demonstrated that such markings are denotational as opposed to ornamental or symbolic in other ways, nor that they have continuously evolved into a representation of language. Even the more modest Schmand-Bezeret hypothesis, in which Mesopotamian writing is seen to develop incrementally from clay tokens to more complex forms of accounting, and finally system-wide cartography, has not stood up to scrutiny. In Mesopotamia and elsewhere, whenever notations become linguistic, that is, transitioning from semantic to phonetic, excuse me, the process appears to involve a relatively swift quantum leap in archaeological terms. Importantly, the surprising speed at which a graphic code can become fully linguistic invites attention to the role of linguistic agency, of human agency rather, in the invention of writing, including intentional social coordination and trial and error experimentation. And here, interestingly, I think we come full circle to those early knowledge traditions where human agency is emphasized in origin stories about writing. All right, we are heading into the home stretch, I promise. And I want to talk briefly about two more areas of significance before I start wrapping up. So far I've been mostly talking about systems rather than scripts, which is a kind of bias of grapholinguistics to care about grammar. But we all know that the visual dimension of writing is extremely important. It's the V in views. It's also the V in wave. So how do we think about visual evolution? This is something I was really interested in when I was at the Max Planck, the way that sign shapes seem to compress towards simplicity. That is, the same amount of information is expressed with less descriptive effort over time. And a standard example is, the visually complex ox head that transforms incrementally into the simpler Greco-Roman A. Such loss of complexity through transmission is also demonstrated experimentally. There's some cool experiments using Pictionary type games, as well as in computational models of script change based on datable paleographic data. So the case of the Vai script of Liberia in West Africa suggests that the compression process may happen early and rapidly. Contrary processes towards increased visual complexity are detected when sign inventories themselves expand over time. So, for example, in the case of the Chinese script. And this suggests that the evolution of letter shapes is at least in part conditioned by the need to balance legibility with production effort. So it's got to be easy to read on the one hand, so distinguishable and not too much of a hassle to write on the other hand. If the number of signs in your system stays more or less the same, then over time signs will simplify because there's no point hanging on to the details. But if you increase the number of signs in your signery, then the individual signs tend to become more complex because you need more detail to distinguish them from each other within the set. And this shows that the graphic evolution of scripts depends to some extent on the relationship of the individual sign to the complete set of signs. These system-wide effects are not the only influence on script complexity, of course, but I think they're significant. So, for example, even when the Chinese government introduced a script simplification campaign on the mainland in, I think, the 1950s, it didn't really influence the overall trend towards complexity in the Chinese script because it is such a big system. So the very last something I'm going to talk about is the bit that I know the least about, so you can help me out, and that's cognition. And this is a much more recent strand of research assisted by advances in neuroimaging technology. Stanislas Dehaene and colleagues have made the case that pre-existing cortical maps in the human brain have been recycled for the purposes of reading. And this is supported by the observation that, or the reality that literacy is a recent human capacity and the brain could not have evolved to accommodate it. In fact, fMRI studies have zeroed in on the so-called visual word form area or letterbox region of the brain that I think you can see on the diagram, VWFA. And this area is associated with recognizing faces, houses, and objects and appears to have been later repurposed for processing written words. So we're not evolved to read, so we have to leverage a part of the brain that's designed for recognizing certain forms, especially faces. And because we all have the same brain structure, any regularities that we see in the visual form of writing are expected to be a reflection of this shared biology. And in a similar vein, visual characteristics of scripts have been shown to conform to innate cognitive biases, including, for example, a preference for cardinality in, vertical and horizontality in sign forms which match an expectation for cardinal and especially vertical forms in nature. As such, the stereotypical forms of signs are seen to conform with regularities in the natural world and are accommodated by biases in the brain, which in turn reduces the overall processing cost because we're already accustomed to seeing that. So think of the fact that when we're in a landscape, we're used to seeing trees or we're used to seeing people, and these are contrasting with a kind of horizon base. So the theory is that this is why writing tends to look like that too. Okay. Okay, so to borrow an analogy from generative grammar, observed variations in the forms of scripts would be regarded as, surface features generated from an underlying universal structure, at least in a very strong formulation of this position. Others have rejected a hard innatist perspective, drawing attention to the primary importance of linguistic structure as opposed to brain structure on the forms that writing takes, as well as the overriding influence of social and political conditions in how it changes or fails to change over time. And I personally tend to be less of an innatist. I think this research is important and very grounding, but it can feed into a scientific culture that views purported universals as the signal and variation as the noise, whereas I think of variation itself as the object of study and universals as limits on that variation. So it's a difference of framing. There are similar concerns in, for example, studies of ancient genomes that are presented as if DNA gives you all the answers at the back of the book when it's merely one point in the triangle, and contextual and comparative and ethnographic interpretation still really, really matters. All right, I am done with my whirlwind tour, so you can exhale for a minute. And what I want to do now is just give a summary of where everyone more or less, I think, agrees. And of course, there's always going to be debates around the edges, but this is where I think we're all on board with for now. So with respect to origins, writing is polygenetic with multiple sites of independent origin. So what this means is that writing is a latent technological capacity that's available for discovery under a range of conditions. And it's not by any stretch a universal milestone of human achievement, but merely one among many other strategies of graphic communication that may be exploited or abandoned or even bypassed. Non-linguistic notational systems provide both the raw material and the priming conditions for the eventual development of writing. These systems themselves, they can be functionally ambivalent. They could be accounting, labeling, whatever, and they may have signs that are multivalent and do not. I didn't talk about multivalency. It's another thing that's super interesting, but they don't on their own predict the eventual exploitation of the glottographic principle. Writing itself is functionally ambivalent. It's neither a precondition of state formation nor a consequence of it. It's often recruited into existing communication practices as a supplement to orality, and may or may not be eventually exploited as a tool of asynchronous communication. Writing is a cognitive linguistic technology, meaning that it is created with the natural constraints of human minds, including the variable linguistic structures reproduced by those minds. Nonetheless, the early development of writing involves a certain amount of directed human attention, coordination, and intervention, just as the subsequent transmission of literacy across generations requires directed social or institutional investment. So writing is not, in other words, biologically predetermined nor purely emergent in the way that languages may be, even if it's constrained within cognitive parameters. And when it comes to evolution of writing, here's what I think is the consensus position. It's often relatively rapid. So when glottography is established in part of a science system, it is often quickly generalized across the whole system. But it doesn't have to generalize. So a graphic code may also abandon glottographic elements or return to them or adopt them selectively, as the examples in the Americas show. The signs of writing exhibit measurable biases in orientation, linearity, cardinality, and relative size. And sign forms nonetheless can change through regular use, intergenerational transmission, the size of the signery, in some cases, institutional intervention. And these processes can, as I've just said, lead to visual schematization, so loss of complexity, but they can also lead to complexification in some conditions or inertia. They can stay the same. Um, And finally, writing systems are relatively resistant to change in terms of their linguistic mappings. This is not something I went into in detail, but it's the case that an underlying system often does not change. It's most likely to shift. So you don't really get a change from a syllabary to an alphabet like Gelb thought you did. That's most likely to shift in response to radical interventions, including the application of the system to a new language with a different structure or through outside reforms, including like top-down reforms, including violent reforms. So this is not something I really talked about today, but it's observable. You don't see these natural shifts so much in the underlying orthographic systems. Okay, so I'm going to end it there. I have my own opinions about where we should go from here in my annual review paper. The too long didn't read version amounts to the following main points. I think we should be aiming somehow to integrate the cognitive, the material, the linguistic, and the sociocultural. And this is what I've called the total grapholinguistic fact, following Michael Silverstein's total linguistic fact. And me and Dimitrios Miletus just discovered that we both independently came up with this term in some of our forthcoming papers. But it's the idea that writing as a phenomenon has more dimensions than meets the eye and requires analysis from more than one angle. And this is exactly what I value about the Cruise and Views projects, the emphasis on things like practice, social organization, materiality, aesthetics. These are not interesting but marginal add-ons. These are the guts of it for me. I think we need to decenter glottographic writing and instead see glottography, or the narrow definition of writing, as merely one kind of graphic code among many, all doing their own thing in their own way with trade-offs. So instead of hierarchical or linear models of graphic codes, we need a more relational model. And this involves active cross-cultural and trans-historical work. And finally, this is just me, but I personally want to invest attention in non-linguistic codes, like this one depicted here, for Central Australian sound narratives, and not because I see them as proto-writing. What I think they do is draw attention to orality and what spoken language is doing within graphic communication. We tend to get fixated on the material trace or to see writing as merely a straightforward embodiment of spoken language, but really I think it's a particular relationship to language. And this is where my work on Australian message sticks is also heading. So this is a code that's doing something functionally similar to writing, but it's much less about storing and retrieving linguistic information than it is about social warranting, making things happen, enacting demands, changing social realities, or validating existing relationships, and using material signs to amplify spoken signs rather than substitute for spoken signs. So that's just a brief glimpse of where I want to see the field going. I don't want us to get trapped in old models, whether it's social evolutionism or biological determinism or whatever. And I don't want us to get too serious about writing either. It's great, but it's not that great. It's something that people do, but also people don't do it. And I want to be able to see it as a practice that we can have different kinds of relationships to. And I'm going to end it there. And I look forward to your thoughts. So thank you.